Yesterday, as you know, oil went through $97 a barrel. Is the small business community going to be more or less impacted by increasing oil prices as compared to the rest of the business world?
Well, I'm not sure whether they'll be more or less impacted, because I just don't know the details. It clearly depends on what sector the small business is in. If they're very dependent on energy, so for example, if the small business is one which is providing a service which doesn't use a lot of energy, then the impact will be fairly small. If it's a small business that's very energy intensive, then of course the impact is larger. And I don't really have the information to tell you where small businesses, which sectors they are relative to large businesses. So I can't really be sure on this. Clearly, the issue of high oil prices is in fact going to impact American businesses in general, because it is a factor increasing the cost of their doing business. The good news is that over time, American businesses have become more and more efficient in terms of using energy. And so the impact on businesses in terms of higher energy prices is much, much smaller than it was, let's say, 20, 30 years ago, where the impact was much larger. And that's very good news. This is part of the ingenuity of the American capitalist structure, that when you have higher prices in a key product for you, that you figure out how to substitute away from it. So is there an issue in terms of businesses for higher energy prices, but also for households? Every time, you know, I know I'm going to fill up my car and it gets more and more expensive when oil prices go up. Does it impact? Certainly it does. But the potential problems from this are not what they used to be.
In your role of being the primary entity that tries to stabilize our economy, you obviously need to be looking to the future. Where do you see oil prices going?
Well, I'm not a forecaster of oil prices. I can tell you that the future markets do see that the oil prices will be coming down from their current very high levels. But the reality is that we have been very surprised. In fact, the markets have been very surprised by this very sharp run-up in oil prices that we've seen. And so there is a lot of uncertainty about oil prices, and in fact, it's something that because most of oil is produced outside the United States, that we don't have a lot of control over. So I think the answer here is that the best bet is that oil prices will come down from their current elevated levels, but realize there's a huge amount of uncertainty about where oil prices may be in the future.
Would the gentleman yield?
Yes, sir.
When you say that they're likely to come down, I would assume what you mean is in the short term, whereas I think what the gentleman may be asking is in the long term, do we anticipate that they're ultimately probably going to be going up?
This is really hard to decide. I mean, we clearly have had a situation where that the fact that many countries that were extremely poor have been developing very rapidly, and this is particularly true, for example, of China, has actually increased demand for petroleum products very substantially. And so in that context, that does have an impact. But we also may see these countries actually realizing that they need to conserve on the use of energy. And so we see actually now policies where subsidies, for example, which keep energy prices exceedingly low in some of these countries, which therefore increases demand, that they're being rethought. So exactly what will happen here is hard to say. The other key issue here is that there's a geopolitical element to this, and a very key geopolitical element. And that's awfully hard to forecast. There are people who are much more better qualified than I to do so.
There's a bit of a scare factor in the oil price now, and for the short term, oil prices may come down a little. For those who believe that in the long term, oil prices will come down, probably also believe in the tooth fairy. In 1970, our country went through a phenomenon that the world is now going through. We reached our maximum oil production in 1970, and in spite of drilling more oil wells than all the rest of the world put together, we now are producing about half the oil we produced in 1970. There is accumulating evidence that the world has reached its maximum production of oil now. There will be some temporary downturns, but the future is just up, up, and away as far as oil prices are concerned. Is there anything that the Federal Reserve or our Congress can do to minimize the negative effects of this for the future on our businesses?
Well, I think that what the Federal Reserve can do is, in fact, to do our job properly. So one thing that's very important and an important change in the success of monetary policy is that in the 1970s, when oil prices went up, that in fact the view was that the Federal Reserve was not going to be able to control inflation, and in fact policies were not such that inflation was controlled, and that then had very negative implications for the economy. And so clearly we don't want to go through that again. And the Federal Reserve, as other central banks, now focuses very much on making sure that inflation is kept under control, and therefore has the benefits that I mentioned, not only in terms of inflation control, but also in terms of the second part of our dual mandate, stabilization of the economy. The problem here is that what can be done about oil prices? In fact, much of this is just out of control of the Federal Reserve. Clearly, there's issues in terms of can technology help? For example, what kind of other energy sources might we be able to access? What kind of conservation can be done in terms of minimizing the use of oil prices, of oil? There have been positive developments in this regard. As I said, that the use of oil per dollar of GDP has actually dropped very, very substantially since the 1970s. And this is one of the reasons why the fear of higher oil prices has been much lessened than it has in the past. The economy has been really quite resilient in the face of these higher oil prices. So can more be done? I'm sure more can be done, but the Federal Reserve really, the only thing that we can do is to make sure that higher oil prices don't spill over into higher inflation in the long run. And that also we monitor what the impact of oil prices will be also on what will happen to aggregate economic activity.